March 24, 1945. USS Bush, northwest of Okinawa. In the heart of the Pacific Theater, the USS Bush sailed through the restless waves as her radar systems hummed with activity. In the dimly lit Combat Information Center, or CIC, radar operator second class James Patterson carefully adjusted the gain control on his radar screen. The phosphorescent arcs of the SG's surface search radar flickered and shifted across the darkened display, painting the image of distant aircraft approaching from Kyushu, more than 60 miles away. Patterson identified over 50 aircraft heading toward the fleet, an ominous sign of what was to come. Commander Roland Westholm stood by, already reaching for the TBS radio to send an urgent update. The Task Force 58 had positioned a network of 16 radar picket stations around Okinawa, forming a protective electronic barrier to ensure no Japanese aircraft could approach without detection. Yet, despite this technological edge, the Americans were about to face an onslaught that would test their systems and resolve. The Japanese Kamikaze units, trained for a singular purpose, to sacrifice themselves to break through American defenses, were now preparing for their deadliest offensive yet. The Japanese strategy was simple: to sacrifice aircraft and pilots in an attempt to break through the American radar defenses and destroy the ships that stood in their way. The radar picket destroyers, positioned at various distances from Okinawa's Zampermasaki Peninsula, were intended to be the first targets of this relentless assault. For the Japanese, the new strategy was clear: one pilot, one plane, one ship. The idea of massing attacks through waves of suicide bombers was now their only hope. By March 1945, these radar picket destroyers had evolved into a new breed of naval sentinel. Once used primarily for hunting submarines, American destroyers now acted as vital guardians for the fleet. These radar pickets were strategically placed between 15 to 95 miles from the reference point at Point Bolo, ensuring a wide radar sweep that could detect threats well before they reached the main fleet. 7 stations were operational by April 1st, with more being activated as the campaign unfolded. Among the destroyers, the USS Laffey, a Sumner-class destroyer, stood out as one of the most formidable ships of the radar picket line. Displacing 2,200 tons and equipped with a variety of anti-aircraft weapons, the Laffey was manned by 336 sailors and commanded by Frederick Julian Beckton. His ship carried 6 5-inch dual-purpose guns, 12 40mm Bofors, and 11 20mm cannons. These defenses were backed by the most advanced fire control radar systems available, systems that were a world apart from the basic setups Japanese vessels had relied on. The CIC aboard the Laffey was a hub of technological innovation. It integrated multiple radar systems into one streamlined display, including air search radar with a range exceeding 60 miles, surface search radar effective to 15 miles, and height-finding radar to determine aircraft altitudes. Additionally, the system linked directly to combat direction circuits, connecting the destroyer to the combat air patrols overhead. This level of integration was a massive leap forward from the simple voice tubes and manual plotting boards used on Japanese carriers.
When it came to gunnery, American ships were far more accurate than their Japanese counterparts. Traditional visual gunnery methods had a dismal hit rate of less than 2% when targeting maneuvering aircraft. The use of radar-guided fire control increased that success rate to 20% under optimal conditions. Adding proximity-fused shells, which exploded near their targets without needing a direct hit, further amplified the defensive capabilities of American ships, turning them into impenetrable fortresses. The Japanese, however, would not relent. At Kanoya Airfield, Lieutenant Yukioki gathered his pilots for one of the most desperate missions yet, Operation Kikusui. The name, Floating Chrysanthemums, would go down in history as the call to action for 355 kamikaze aircraft and 341 conventional bombers. This massive coordinated assault aimed to pierce the heart of the American defenses and strike a blow to their carriers. While the radar pickets acted as bait to draw kamikaze planes away from the main fleet, the sacrifices of these destroyers were not without consequence. They became the first line of defense, taking the brunt of the attack while fighter cover worked to intercept the attackers. These destroyers, however, were not easily taken down. In fact, their resilience in the face of overwhelming odds proved to be a critical factor in Japan's eventual defeat. Throughout the course of the kamikaze offensive, several American ships proved their toughness under fire. The USS Intrepid withstood 5 kamikaze strikes and continued to serve. The USS Ticonderoga, though heavily damaged and with 144 men killed, remained operational. The USS Essex survived a kamikaze strike on November 25, 1944, which killed 15 men but caused minimal structural damage. Perhaps most dramatically, the USS Bunker Hill, despite taking 2 kamikaze hits in rapid succession on May 11, 1945, which killed 389 men, still managed to sail under her own power to safety. By March 1945, with the commissioning of the USS Bonham Richard as the 14th Essex-class carrier, the scale of American air power in the Pacific was overwhelming. There were now more than 100 operational carrier crafts, a striking contrast to Japan's fleet, which had no operational carriers left and fewer than 5,000 aircraft. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz reflected on the strategic significance of this achievement in a report to Admiral Ernest King. The Essex-class carriers were not just ships. They represented American industrial prowess, technological superiority, and unmatched training. They embodied a systematic advantage that Japan could not counter, a factor that would define the course of the war and shape the future of naval combat.
The final waves of the war in the Pacific saw USS Shangri-La commissioned on September 15, 1944, followed by USS Lake Champlain on June 3, 1945, and USS Tarawa on December 8, 1945. The momentum of carrier production never slowed, even after victory was assured. These ships and the carriers that followed were not just built for World War II, they were designed with an eye toward future conflicts, reinforcing the U.S. Navy's dominance on the seas for decades to come. From the first strikes in the Central Pacific to the final amphibious assaults on Okinawa, the Essex-class carriers were the backbone of American naval power. 15 carriers participated in the Marianas invasion, launching 470 fighter sweeps, 220 bombing strikes, and maintaining constant combat air patrols for 19 consecutive days. American carriers sustained aircraft availability rates of over 80%, even amidst heavy losses and constant wear, securing victory and ensuring that Japanese land-based aviation could never again pose a threat. In the final months of World War II, the Imperial Japanese Navy implemented a new and desperate strategy, the kamikaze. It was an act of utter sacrifice, one that involved young pilots flying their planes directly into enemy ships in suicide missions. Among the first to adopt this tactic was Vice Admiral Takajiro Onishi, who established Japan's first official kamikaze unit in October 1944. The first successful kamikaze attack occurred on October 25, 1944, when Lieutenant Yukioki Seki led his unit to sink the USS St. Lo. This marked the beginning of a campaign that would define the final stages of the war in the Pacific. The pilots recruited for these missions were often very young, with minimal training. The youngest of these pilots was just 17 years old. Their training was intensely abbreviated. They spent a mere 7 days preparing for combat, which focused on the basics: flying in formation, identifying ship types, and understanding how to execute a dive attack. There were just 2 days dedicated to takeoff practice. 2 more to formation flying, and 3 to attacking targets. Navigational training was largely non-existent. The escorts, typically destroyers, would guide them to the target zone, and once they arrived, it was a simple matter of diving and hitting the target. Combat maneuvering, evading enemy fire, and defensive tactics were not part of the curriculum. The mission was straightforward: dive and strike. The kamikaze tactic was initially born out of desperation, but soon became an integral part of Japan's strategic efforts. At the time, Japanese commanders, particularly Admiral Onishi, were aware of the enemy's technological superiority, particularly American radar systems. These radar systems were able to detect aircraft at long ranges, giving U.S. forces a significant advantage. However, the Japanese recognized a critical vulnerability in the American radar pickets positioned around Okinawa. These radar-equipped destroyers were placed 30 to 60 miles away from the fleet, making it difficult for them to provide mutual support or concentrate their defensive firepower. The radar systems could give early warning, but they had limitations in terms of coverage and coordination. The strategy behind the kamikaze assault was brutal in its simplicity. If even a small fraction of the attacking planes hit their targets, the damage would outweigh the cost. For every one pilot and his obsolete aircraft lost, the Japanese hoped to sink American warships that cost millions of dollars and carry hundreds of sailors. As dawn approached on April 6, 1945, the U.S. Navy's radar picket stations were on high alert. The destroyers and their supporting vessels formed a defensive perimeter, maintaining a 5,000-yard patrol, moving in a constant cycle every 30 minutes to evade submarine attacks.
The radar systems of the U.S. Navy were state-of-the-art and allowed for constant monitoring of the skies and seas. The SC-2 radar tracked airborne targets, while the SG radar monitored the ocean surface. Meanwhile, the Mark 12 and Mark 22 fire control radars locked onto individual targets, enabling precise gunfire from the ships. The SP height-finding radar measured the altitude of incoming aircraft, allowing for timely fighter interception. Despite these advanced systems, the distances between the picket stations and the main fleet made coordination difficult. At any given time, only 2 F-6F Hellcats or F-4U Corsairs were stationed at each radar picket station during daylight hours. The response time for additional fighter support from the main fleet was typically 20 to 30 minutes under optimal conditions, a window of time that would prove critical. At 0300 hours on April 6th, radar operators at the picket stations began to pick up a wave of incoming kamikaze aircraft. The first wave was detected approaching from the northwest. The radar screen lit up with over 100 incoming contacts, indicating a large-scale attack. The radar picket stations were now bracing for impact, with their limited forces trying to assess the magnitude of the assault. At Radar Picket Station Number 1, aboard the destroyer Bush, the Combat Information Center (CIC) team tracked multiple raid groups approaching from different directions. The first raid, consisting of 40 aircraft, was detected at a bearing of 340 degrees. Another group of 20 aircraft was approaching from the southeast at 015 degrees. A third raid's composition was unclear, but it was bearing 285 degrees. In response, Lieutenant Frank Adams, a fighter direction officer, ordered his air combat patrol to intercept. The situation was dire. Only 2 Corsairs were available to engage over 30 kamikaze planes, a staggering imbalance in firepower. The kamikaze pilots, trained to use the radar horizon to mask their final approach, descended to wave-top height and closed in on the ships. The attackers used the radar limitations to their advantage, exploiting the gaps in coverage that existed between the picket stations. The radar-equipped picket ships could only defend themselves with their own firepower,
while the main fleet could offer support only after a considerable delay. As the kamikazes neared the picket stations, the tactical odds were clearly stacked in favor of the attackers. The kamikaze attacks on Okinawa represented a brutal evolution in the tactics of war. The Japanese had gone from making isolated, desperate suicide attacks to launching systematic waves of attackers with the intent to overwhelm American defenses. On this fateful day, the mathematics of combat, combined with the tragic sacrifice of the kamikaze pilots, would tip the balance in favor of the attackers, at least in the short term. Commander Westholme had thoroughly prepared his gunnery teams for the harrowing task ahead. His orders were simple: track the designated targets continuously, engage when aircraft reached 12,000 yards regardless of the accuracy of the targeting solution, and maintain a maximum rate of fire until target was destroyed or passed over the ship. There would be no check fire. Any aircraft approaching the picket line was to be treated as hostile. The ordeal for Bush began at 1500 hours. After shooting down 2 incoming planes, a Nakajima B-6N torpedo bomber managed to break through the barrage of defensive fire. The kamikaze hit its mark, crashing between the 2 smokestacks on the starboard side. Its bomb detonated in the forward engine room, sending steam pouring through ruptured pipes. 14 crew members died instantly, but Bush stayed afloat. Damage control crews fought to contain fires while the ship's gunners continued to fend off more attacks. By 1700, the destroyer Kohun had maneuvered into position to assist Bush, bringing 4 fighter aircraft with her. What followed was a scene of utter aerial chaos as 40 to 50 Japanese aircraft descended on the 2 destroyers. At 1730, Kohun was struck by a kamikaze, an enemy Zero that crashed onto her main deck. 3 more kamikazes followed in quick succession, their attacks devastating the ship. Commander George Wilson issued orders to abandon ship, and Kohun rapidly broke apart and sank. 35 of her crew were killed. Despite suffering severe damage, Bush continued to fight back. At 1725, a second kamikaze crashed into Bush's port side between the stacks. The explosion ripped through the ship, nearly severing it in half. Less than an hour later, at 1745, a third kamikaze struck, this time above the main deck on the port side. Ammunition began detonating, and fires spread uncontrollably across the ship. By 1830, Bush rolled over and sank. Of the 307 men aboard, 87 lost their lives, including several from Commander James Willis's staff, who had been on board as part of Destroyer Division 48. The survivors were left in the water for up to 10 hours before being rescued. The LCS L-64 arrived on the scene at 21:30, pulling exhausted men from the oil-slicked waters, all while under threat of further air attacks. The toll of April 6, 1945 was staggering. Kamikaze attacks that day sank Bush, Kohun, and Emmons, a destroyer minesweeper, along with 2 ammunition ships. 10 other vessels were damaged, but the radar picket stations had fulfilled their mission. The main fleet, anchored at Higuchi, had been largely untouched. These destroyers had absorbed the full force of the enemy's fury, protecting the invasion force. On April 15th, USS Laffey arrived at Radar Picket Station No. 1, relieving the J. William D. Tao. Commander Beckton gathered his department heads to discuss the situation. The Japanese had changed tactics, making the attacks more unpredictable. Small groups of aircraft began infiltrating at dawn and dusk, using the cover of clouds and rain squalls for concealment. Coordinated attacks from multiple directions sought to overwhelm the ship's fire control systems. While Laffey had already survived kamikaze strikes during previous engagements at Lingayen Gulf and Iwo Jima, Okinawa was proving to be a different challenge entirely. The proximity of Japanese airfields on Kyushu and Formosa meant that attacks would be relentless, with no rest periods. The ship remained on general quarters from dawn to dusk and often through the night. On April 16th, the situation unfolded exactly as Commander Becton had anticipated. The Japanese intensified their efforts, and Laffey was forced to fight once again against an overwhelming enemy force. At 0727, radar operators aboard the USS Laffey made their first contact of the morning, a single aircraft approaching from the southeast at a range of 11 miles. The enemy aircraft, identified as a Naval dive bomber, was using the low-lying waves and the early sunlight to conceal its approach. As the plane drew closer, Commander Becton ordered an immediate hard right turn, increasing speed to flank. The destroyer Laffey heeled sharply, its engines roaring as it accelerated past 30 knots. The Naval pilot adjusted his trajectory, aiming directly for the bridge. At 2,000 yards, the starboard guns of the Laffey opened fire, unleashing a barrage of shells. The bomber absorbed multiple hits but continued its descent. Just as the aircraft neared its target, a 5-inch shell detonated beneath it, tearing off the left wing and sending the plane into a violent spiral. The wreckage crashed into the sea, 50 yards from the Laffey's hull. The crew exhaled, but this momentary victory was only the beginning. At 0800, the Combat Information Center, CIC, reported an even more ominous development: multiple air raids converging on the ship. The first estimate placed the number of attacking aircraft at around 50, separated into several groups. Laffey was heavily outnumbered, but engaged the attackers with what little firepower it had left. Over the next 80 minutes, the ship endured an unprecedented onslaught of kamikaze attacks, the likes of which would go down in naval history as one of the most intense periods of combat ever fought by a destroyer. The first wave consisted of 8 kamikaze aircraft. The destroyer's gunners fired relentlessly, taking down every attacker before it could reach its target. The crews had learned to synchronize their shots, concentrating fire from multiple mounts and maintaining a constant barrage. They did not pause to celebrate or acknowledge hits. There was always another aircraft approaching, but the tide was beginning to shift. At 0827, the 9th kamikaze, the Yokosuka D4Y Judy, appeared from the ship's stern. With fewer guns able to track the attacker, the aircraft was able to strike gun mount 53, the after 5-inch mount. The explosion killed 6 men instantly, including the mount captain and the gunner's mate. Fires ignited across the fantail, and the ammunition began to cook off, leading to further destruction. The 11th aircraft hit minutes later, another D4Y Judy attacking from the port quarter. It crashed into the after deck house, destroying 2 20mm gun mounts and killing their crews. The fires spread quickly, and the damage control team struggled to contain the blaze, which was threatening to reach the after magazine. Meanwhile, the gunners continued to engage the relentless stream of attackers. The 11th aircraft, a Naval dive bomber, released a bomb that struck between the ship's 2 smokestacks. The explosion penetrated into the machine shop, rupturing steam lines and knocking out electrical power throughout the ship. With power lost to gun mounts 42 and 43, their rate of fire dropped significantly. As the morning wore on, the situation became more desperate. At 0900, Laffey faced her most perilous moment. 4 kamikazes attacked simultaneously, coming from multiple directions. The ship's fire control systems, already overwhelmed, could only track 2 of them. The first Naval crashed into a gun mount, while the second struck the port side near the waterline. A third kamikaze dropped a bomb that exploded in the after engine room, and the 4th was destroyed just 100 yards away by close-range fire from a 20mm mount. Despite the ferocity of the attacks, Laffey was not yet sunk. She was burning from bridge to stern, her rudder jammed hard to the left, forcing the ship into a continuous circle. The ship's speed was reduced to a crawl of 8 knots, and nearly a third of her crew had either been killed or wounded. With 6 of her gun mounts either destroyed or disabled, Commander Becton received grim reports from all departments. The situation was critical, but not hopeless. The forward guns were still operational, and the damage control parties were doing their best to contain the fires. The ship was holding together, despite the carnage. At one point, Assistant Communications Officer Lieutenant Frank Manson suggested preparing to abandon ship. Commander Becton's response was nothing short of legendary. "No, I'll never abandon this ship as long as a single gun can fire." A nearby lookout, speaking quietly, added, "And if I can find one man to fire it." For the next 20 minutes, the ship faced even more attacks. 4 additional kamikazes came at Laffey, and the remaining gunners managed to destroy 3 of them. The fourth, a Zero carrying a 550-pound bomb, made it through and crashed into the base of the forward stack. The resulting explosion lifted the entire bridge structure, only to slam it back down onto the ship's deck. Despite suffering catastrophic damage, Laffey remained afloat, her crew's determination ensuring that she would not be lost that day. Their ability to keep fighting under such dire circumstances remains one of the most remarkable feats of naval resilience in history. March 24, 1945, USS Laffey, Okinawa, Combat Information Center. As the radar systems on the USS Laffey hummed, the crew on board the destroyer prepared for the inevitable. Radar operator Second Class James Patterson was adjusting the gain control of his radar, carefully tracking the approaching threats. In the darkened Combat Information Center, CIC, the radar screens flickered, revealing ghostly traces of incoming aircraft from Kyushu, 62 miles away. The incoming swarm of over 50 aircraft signaled a dire warning to the defenders. Commander Frederick Julian Becton monitored the situation as the radar systems and fire control systems began to coordinate with the carrier task forces. The American naval forces had established a powerful radar network with 16 radar picket stations encircling Okinawa. This defense system, relying heavily on electronic detection and communication, had been designed to protect against the very onslaught that was now heading toward them. But this technological edge would soon be tested by a relentless and desperate assault.
The Japanese kamikaze units, the epitome of desperation and sacrifice, were now pushing forward. Their mission was simple, yet horrifying. Crash their planes into American warships, ensuring that each pilot's life would be exchanged for the destruction of a ship. The radar picket destroyers, such as the USS Laffey, were strategically placed on the outermost line of defense. These ships were meant to be the first line of contact, drawing the enemy's attack before it could reach the heart of the American fleet. Laffey, a Sumner-class destroyer, was equipped with an array of advanced anti-aircraft weapons. Her arsenal included 6 5-inch dual-purpose guns, 12 40mm Bofors, and 11 20mm Ehrlichen cannons, all supported by the latest Mark 37 gun directors and fire control radar systems. The ship's CIC integrated multiple radar systems to cover every possible threat. It featured air search radar with a range of over 60 miles, surface search radar for shorter ranges, and height-finding radar to pinpoint the altitude of incoming aircraft. This advanced radar system, combined with the proximity-fused shells, would give the ship an edge in accuracy and effectiveness, even in the face of overwhelming odds. As the first wave of kamikazes arrived, the chaos inside Laffey's CIC was palpable. For 3 minutes, the ship was left blind and mute after a direct hit caused smoke to fill the compartment, knocking the crew unconscious. When they regained consciousness, they found their radar systems flickering and their communication lines were down. During this critical moment, the 20th kamikaze approached undetected. This aircraft, a Naval dive bomber, dove from 8,000 feet, its exact trajectory only visible as it neared the ship. Despite operating in manual mode, gunner's mate Staff First Class Robert Carr on Mount 44 maintained steady tracking and the crew fired continuously. The Naval exploded 500 feet above the ship, showering the forward deck with debris. But the battle was far from over. The 21st kamikaze appeared, from the stern, hidden in the smoke created by Laffey's own fires. A Kate torpedo bomber approached, targeting the forward magazine. Seaman Foutritus, still stationed at his damaged 20mm mount, spotted the aircraft 400 yards away and opened fire. His shots hit the engine, causing the bomber to nosedive and crash just 30 yards from the ship. The explosion provided a brief respite, as seawater doused the flames,
helping to suppress the raging fires aboard Laffey. At 0947, the 22nd and final Kamikaze approached. By now, Laffey had been under continuous attack for 80 minutes, and the crew was exhausted. Their ammunition was running low, and their defensive capabilities had been reduced by 70%. Yet, despite the overwhelming odds, Laffey's gunners continued to fight. LCSL-51, a nearby gunboat, joined the defense. Lieutenant Shearing, aboard the gunboat, made the decision to move his vessel between the incoming Kamikaze and Laffey. The Naval pilot, now having to choose between two targets, opted for the destroyer. The Kamikaze flew 50 feet above LCSL-51, narrowly missing the gunboat's mast. Shearing's gunners opened fire, and the Kamikaze, trailing smoke, eventually crashed into the sea just 100 yards from Laffey. The battle, though intense, was finally over. Laffey had survived 22 Kamikaze attacks in just over an hour, taking hits from 6 aircraft and 4 bombs. 32 men were killed, and 71 others were wounded, but the ship remained afloat. The mathematics of survival told a powerful story. Laffey's gunners had fired over 8,000 rounds during the battle, shooting down 9 Kamikazes and severely damaging 4 others that missed or crashed short of their targets. Even with CIC systems damaged, the radar systems continued to provide critical targeting information, and proximity fuses made the defense even more effective.
The radar PICKET system used around Okinawa marked a revolutionary shift in naval warfare. For the first time, electronic detection and fire control systems played a greater role in victory than traditional armor or speed. The radar PICKET destroyers became not just scouts, but command and control platforms, managing the three-dimensional battle space, tracking threats from over 60 miles away horizontally and 30,000 feet vertically. The fighter direction teams aboard these ships guided over 5,000 fighter interceptions, destroying nearly 1,900 enemy aircraft before they could reach the attacking positions. However, the human cost of this technological edge was staggering. The radar PICKET destroyers took the brunt of Japanese desperation. Over the course of the 82-day Okinawa campaign, 15 destroyers and destroyer minesweepers were sunk in the line of duty. An additional 45 ships were damaged, and more than 4,900 sailors were either killed or wounded on the PICKET stations alone. On May 4th, the USS Morrison and USS Luce were both struck during radar PICKET duty. Despite their radar tracking the incoming raids with precision and their fire control systems performing optimally, they were overwhelmed when 40 aircraft attacked simultaneously. Morrison sank within minutes, losing 152 of her crew. The radar systems had done their job, but the sheer number of attacks was too great for even the best technology to overcome. In post-war reflections, Captain Ricky Hay Inguchi, who had helped develop kamikaze tactics, would remark on the unprecedented challenges posed by the American radar systems. "The American destroyers fought with incredible courage," he wrote. "Their radar gave them advantages we hadn't anticipated. They could see our aircraft forming up over our own airfields. They tracked us across hundreds of miles of ocean. Their fire control was devastating in its accuracy." One significant insight emerged from the experience of those on the front lines of radar-based naval defense during the Okinawa campaign. Initially, the radar-equipped destroyers on PICKET duty were seen as vulnerable due to their isolated positions far from the main fleet. However, it soon became clear that this assumption was flawed. The radar systems, while seemingly isolated, were actually the crucial link in a vast, interconnected defense network that spanned the entire American fleet. The Japanese pilots, flying outdated aircraft with minimal training, were facing a defense that was much more coordinated and formidable than they had anticipated. Attacking a single destroyer did not mean taking on just one ship. It meant facing the combined defenses of dozens of vessels and hundreds of aircraft, all coordinated by radar and electronic systems that worked seamlessly together. The technological divide between the two forces had reached a point where it was nearly impossible to overcome. Japanese pilots, who were often inexperienced and flying aircraft that were ill-suited for the task, found themselves up against American ships equipped with radar-directed guns and proximity-fused shells. These advanced weapons were paired with fighter aircraft that were directed toward their targets by shipboard radar operators. In many cases, the American fighters intercepted the kamikaze formations well before they could get within range of their intended targets, often 50 miles away from the fleet. Radar had replaced visual combat, turning the battle into an electronic contest rather than a physical one.
The psychological toll on Japanese pilots was profound. They had expected to find scattered, vulnerable targets, but instead they encountered a well-organized, highly coordinated defensive system. Their approaches were tracked from takeoff to impact by radar operators sitting comfortably in air-conditioned rooms, while fighter directors calmly spoke over radio handsets, directing the defense with mathematical precision. The mystique of the warrior, who thrived on individual skill and bravery, seemed to fade in the face of such technological superiority. The battle was now determined by the technicians, the men who controlled the radar systems, the gunners, and the fighter directors. By May 11, 1945, it had become clear that the Japanese had adapted their tactics to deal with the radar network's dominance. They began to concentrate their attacks on the radar picket stations, where weather conditions might degrade the effectiveness of the radar. Some kamikaze pilots attempted low-altitude approaches, using nearby islands for terrain masking, while others used window, strips of metal foil, to create false radar returns, confusing American radar operators. The Japanese were also stepping up their electronic warfare efforts. However, the American response was swift and effective, with constant improvements to radar systems and countermeasures. New SP height-finding radars were introduced, eliminating any gaps in vertical coverage and ensuring that incoming aircraft could be detected from all angles. Upgraded identification friend or foe (IFF) systems minimized the risk of friendly fire incidents, and the development of data links between ships enabled more coordinated and effective defense. The technological gap, instead of narrowing, continued to widen in favor of the Americans. One of the clearest examples of this evolved defensive capability came on May 11, 1945, when the destroyer Hugh W. Hadley was stationed at Radar Picket Station 15. The ship came under attack by over 150 kamikaze and conventional aircraft in several waves. Despite the overwhelming odds, the Hadley's Combat Information Center, CIC, successfully managed 6 separate radar plots, coordinated the interception of 12 fighter aircraft from the Combat Air Patrol, CAP, and directed anti-aircraft fire from the ship, as well as 3 supporting vessels. The result was remarkable. 23 enemy aircraft were shot down, and the Hadley itself was severely damaged but remained afloat. The ship's crew suffered 28 deaths and 67 injuries. Had it not been for the radar systems, the outcome could have been catastrophic. Commander Mullaney, who captained the Hadley, later described the experience as akin to the role of an infantry point man, always the first to face danger. But unlike an infantryman who could only see a few yards ahead, the radar operators aboard the Hadley had a much broader perspective. Our radar gave us the eyes of an eagle. We could see death coming from 50 miles away and prepare to meet it. In essence, the experience at Okinawa proved that radar, along with other technological advancements, had fundamentally changed the nature of naval warfare. The radar picket stations, once thought to be vulnerable and expendable, had become the backbone of American defense, allowing the fleet to maintain its position and push back against the relentless kamikaze assaults. The ability to see the enemy before they could even approach, combined with highly coordinated responses, turned what could have been a disastrous attack into a defensive triumph. As the battle raged on, it became clear that the technological edge had not only tipped the scales in favor of the Americans, but had irrevocably altered the course of the war in the Pacific.
The industrial impact on the outcome of the war could not have been clearer. American shipyards were churning out new radar systems at a pace of over 200 units per month. In stark contrast, Japan's aircraft production had dwindled to fewer than 500 planes per month,
many of which were outdated designs. The equation was undeniable. The industrial capabilities of the United States were advancing at a far greater rate than Japan's. American pilots could be trained and equipped quickly, whereas each destroyed kamikaze pilot represented months of costly training and preparation that Japan could not afford to replace. On the other hand, even when American destroyers were damaged, they were quickly repaired and returned to service with upgraded equipment and battle-hardened crews. What Japan had anticipated would be a war of attrition that wore down American resolve, instead highlighted the overwhelming superiority of American industry. By June 22, 1945, organized Japanese resistance on Okinawa had finally come to an end. The radar picket stations, which had been critical to the defense of the island, had been operational for a full 90 days. Over this period, they had tracked thousands of enemy aircraft, directed fighters to intercept over 1,900 raids, and directly engaged roughly 600 kamikaze aircraft that had made it through to the attack positions. The strategic significance of these efforts would profoundly alter the nature of Pacific warfare. The planned invasion of Japan, codenamed Operation Downfall, was poised to involve massive radar picket lines modeled on the experiences in Okinawa. These picket stations would be manned by hundreds of destroyers equipped with the most advanced radar technology. The idea was to create electronic barriers that would protect the invasion fleets, preventing Japanese aircraft from attacking with impunity. Air direction would be centralized in specialized command ships, allowing for highly coordinated defense efforts. The Japanese homeland would no longer face isolated ship defenses, but instead an integrated air defense network that stretched across vast distances, covering hundreds of miles. Admiral Mate Ugaki, the commander of the 5th Air Fleet, delivered his final assessment of the situation before carrying out his own kamikaze attack on August 15, 1945. He recognized the insurmountable challenge posed by American technology. The American radar pickets have constructed an invisible barrier around their forces. Our pilots fly at them like birds crashing against glass. We see the target, but we cannot reach it. Technology has triumphed over our resolve. The USS Laffey survived the remainder of World War II and continued to serve in the U.S. Navy for another 3 decades, ultimately becoming a museum ship. Though its radar systems may appear rudimentary by today's standards, they represented a monumental shift in naval warfare at the time. The ability to detect targets beyond the line of sight, track multiple contacts simultaneously, and direct weapons with unmatched accuracy fundamentally altered the way naval battles were fought. Reflecting on the pivotal radar picket duty during the Okinawa campaign, Commander Becton offered profound insight into the nature of modern warfare. At Okinawa, we proved that wars are no longer won by the side with the bravest fighters or the greatest willingness to sacrifice. In the future, wars will be decided by the side with the most advanced technology and the industrial might to produce it in overwhelming quantities. The radar picket destroyers, in his view, were not just ships. They were a manifestation of America's technological and industrial superiority.
The human cost of this technological shift was immense. Nearly 5,000 American sailors lost their lives or were wounded while on radar picket duty, and almost 2,000 kamikaze missions were launched against them. Hundreds of Japanese pilots perished in the sea, their sacrifices seeming to achieve little more than their own destruction. However, out of this bloodshed emerged a new paradigm for warfare. The importance of electronic systems in battle became undeniable. It was no longer simply firepower that determined victory, but information superiority, the ability to collect, analyze, and act on data faster than the enemy. The radar picket destroyers had not only defended against the relentless wave of kamikaze attacks, but it also demonstrated the future trajectory of warfare.
These ships had revealed that the decisive advantage in modern combat would be gained through the manipulation of information, not just the strength of weapons. From this moment on, the side capable of processing and utilizing battlefield data more efficiently would hold the upper hand. Deep beneath the waters of the Pacific Ocean, the wrecks of numerous destroyers rest alongside the remains of countless Japanese aircraft. Their crews, who fought with valor despite the odds, are remembered by both sides for their courage. Yet, their sacrifice represented more than just heroism. It marked the turning point when technology emerged as the dominant factor in war. It was the moment when radar operators, seated in the dimly lit combat information centers, had a more significant influence on the battle's outcome than the admirals commanding from the bridge. The era of intuition and traditional warrior skill was giving way to an age where cold, calculated mathematics and electronic precision would reign supreme. The future of warfare belonged to nations capable of advancing their electronic capabilities and training their personnel to harness these technologies. The radar picket destroyers of Okinawa didn't just hold off an enemy, they demonstrated the future of military conflict. The invisible, electronic battlefield, governed by radar and sensors, would determine the winners of future wars. The nation that could field superior systems for gathering intelligence, processing it quickly, and linking it across vast distances would emerge as the dominant force. The legacy of those radar picket ships lies not in their guns or their armor, but in the radar arrays that gave them the ability to see the oncoming storm of death and to take the technological steps needed to confront it. In that radar, the future of warfare had already been written, one where information, not firepower, would decide the victor.